Alright, so to continue on, we'll fast forward a little bit to right around the time of the Civil War and the ending of slavery. Many of you have been taught in school that Lincoln was some sort of abolitionist hero and that he fought for the freedom of the slaves and that he did so and freed the slaves because he, truly cared for them and wanted to see them free and, so on and so forth. And I hate to break it to you, but that couldn't be further from the truth. There are numerous reports and writings by Lincoln himself which claimed that although he was morally against slavery, he did not want to abolish it. The only reason that he did was as a means to cripple the South's economy and power structure. He saw that they were becoming very powerful, and what other way to cripple them than to, hit them where it would hurt the most, their economy. And the slave trade was a large part of their economy there. So that's why he did that. And initially, when the Emancipation Proclamation was being drawn up, this was only guaranteeing freedom to the slaves in the South. This didn't include the border states or the North. Okay. So once the end of the Civil War came, and these 2 million slaves were going to be freed, you then all of a sudden had these white unions pop up, which were trying to, save, Europeans from being unemployed. Because now you have, just like Dr. Umar Johnson said, that now you would have had 2 million Negro slaves getting ready to hit the workforce who are just as qualified, if not more qualified in certain circumstances, than their European counterparts. This scared the hell out of these people. So how else do you keep the Negroes destitute? You form these unions and you keep them out of work. How else do you do it? By Jim Crow. Now, the Jim Crow laws preach this separate but equal nonsense. Okay? All Jim Crow was the U.S.'s version of apartheid. And if you don't know what apartheid is, research South Africa and Nelson Mandela. Okay? The U.S. thought that they were doing something, somehow more humane and better than, the Dutch in South Africa by having these separate but equal policies. Now, mind you, let's, remember what we were talking about in the other articles about how, it's been spread the world over that, Africans intellectually are inferior to Europeans. They somehow suffer this arrested development as they, get older. They can never have the, intelligence level greater than that of a 14-year-old European. So now you have these separate but equal laws and policies in place, okay, which includes education, by the way. What kind of education do you think the Negroes were getting then? Do you think they were getting the same type of education as Europeans? No. And who put these laws into place? The whites in power, the oppressors put this in place, okay? Did you have blacks representing themselves in Congress, in the Senate, in any of this to decide these laws being enacted? No. Of course you didn't. But then again, white privilege doesn't exist, right? No? Yeah? So again, Jim Crow was nothing more than apartheid wrapped in an American flag. That's all it was. But they'll tell you that it was, it was better for the people, that there was no way they could, integrate with one another, blacks and whites, that none of this was possible. You even have a senator from Alabama by the name of J. Thomas Heflin. Okay, he was a senator from Alabama, okay? He spoke on the House floor to the Senate by saying, "Death to the Negro who seeks racial integration." And he said that whenever a Negro crosses the dead line between white and Negro races and lays his black hand on a white woman, he deserves to die. Now you have men like this who represented everyone, black and white. There was no black representation in Congress or the Senate, okay? You have men like this deciding the laws of the land. But you don't think white privilege exists? Why weren't these laws applied to Europeans as well? Why just Negroes and other immigrants? So, also to point out too, when as it relates to Jim Crow, with many of these states that had Jim Crow as law of the land, the states that were responsible for that, many of them did not repeal interracial marriage bans until 1967, 1968, which means that it wasn't legal for my parents to marry for 14 years before they did. My parents married in 1981. Okay? 14 years prior to that, only 14 years prior to that, it was still illegal in many states for them to marry. Meaning that my mother most certainly would have went to jail and suffered heavy fines. And so would my father. Just doesn't make any sense. And if you read your history books and learn more about apartheid, you will see how similar what the Dutch were doing to the Africans there is to what the Europeans were doing to the Africans and the Negroes in the U.S. You will see many, many similarities. It's not that different. It's not that different. Maybe the methods differed, but the end goal was the same. It was the same. Alright, so to close this out, I just want to say a couple of things. The evidence that I presented, I believe, paints a picture of a social system of white privilege that has been, 3 or 4 centuries in the making now. And for those of you who continue to deny the existence of white privilege, again, I already said it that the thrust of that argument happens to be behind, from what I've seen and what gathered, that it's from a lack of tangible benefits that you're not receiving. I also believe it to be of a lack of knowledge of the history, of African history, of your own history. Because if you can look at what we talked about today, and whatever else you research in the future, if you can look at those facts, which clearly support the construction of a social system of white privilege, and still deny it, I would really have to question your logic, or at least have you explain it to me, because it just doesn't make sense how you can look at that, the evidence there, and conclude anything else. But again, if you do, fine, okay, please explain it to me, because I just don't understand how you can. Again, acknowledging that white privilege exists by whites does not make you guilty of anything. What I believe many Africans and African Americans want is for you to acknowledge that yes, it exists, and to fight alongside us in dismantling it. Okay? And I want to point something else out real quick too. Many of you may or may not have seen some of the speeches and videos made when F.W. de Klerk, who was the president after P.W. Botha in South Africa during the apartheid regime, where he is talking about the African National Congress, which is a black movement that was headed up at the time and led by Nelson Mandela. But he always made reference to the ANC as being a terrorist organization who committed violent acts, who supported violent acts, openly engaged in violent acts, but always failed to talk about how the white police officers and white minority in South Africa were openly killing, murdering, and butchering blacks on a daily basis. But yet he always painted the ANC as a horrible organization, a terrorist organization. Now look at how many African Americans are viewed in the U.S., and especially how the Black Lives Matter movement is painted, how the Civil Rights Movement was painted, how Malcolm X was painted, and you'll see the similarities. They paint all of these black movements as terrorists, as thugs, as those who live that life, and as many of people, people that I know have said, they paint them that way. But for those of you who think that, people who support the Black Lives Matter movement, or, the Negroes that you see in the ghettos in the U.S., as living that life, put yourself in their shoes. What the hell would you do if there was a system of oppression created to keep you exactly where you are, to keep you destitute and poor, and to see your eventual end as a race? How would you feel? And for those of you who deny white privilege exists and have married someone of an opposite color, namely African American, read your history. Would you still have the same view then? I can promise you wouldn't. And if you still do, you haven't read anything. But for those of you who are of Caucasian descent and have married someone of African American descent or African descent, to believe that white privilege does not exist, it's mind-boggling. But it also means that you do not know African culture at all, other than what you've been told by someone else in a classroom. You've done zero research on your own. If you disagree, fine, disagree. Explain your logic. We can talk about it. But I know for a fact you have zero knowledge of African culture. And perhaps you should get some. Doesn't mean you're a bad person. Doesn't mean you're an idiot. It just means that you don't know the history of African culture. That's it. And it's as simple as picking up a book. Okay? It's as simple as picking up a book. These conversations have to happen. And in order for more people, black and white, to become comfortable with talking about race with one another, without there being, this feeling of resentment and hatred or whatever, you have to read first. You have to read these things. You have to read the history. Okay? Share that history, share your experiences, and talk about it. For that to happen is not difficult. We are making it difficult. We are making it difficult. Many of these views that go against the evidence is a lot of times born out of ignorance. So please educate yourselves. It is not that scary. What is scary is that you feel your beliefs may be challenged. And yes, they will be challenged. But is that really such a bad thing? Think about it.